In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read ancient tomes, the order of the Abracast. We are the brave and bold.
The Ages begins with the shocking story of Cain and Abel and the journey of violence and revenge spanning thousands of years, following Cain through his cursed life from an ancient invasion of malicious angels to the American Revolutionary War. A masterful, compelling journey through time, The Ages delves deep into arcane knowledge, myth, and legend. The art is stunning, and the story takes you on a journey where mortals, immortals, angels, and demons are all forced to deal with the folly that is God's creation. It's a beautifully dark and gritty ride through history. This 4-part story follows the astrological procession of the ages and how each 2,500-year age parallels major changes in the development of Earth's inhabitants. Cain's blasphemous struggle with the divine and sacred tyrant God will create and crumble empires, shape history, and cause a cosmic cataclysm.
The first contact came at 1607, when Staff Sergeant John McReynolds Bradley drove right on top of an Iraqi bunker positioned to provide early warning to the forces in the village. 2 enemy soldiers emerged and surrendered. Staff Sergeant McReynolds took them prisoner and transported them to our trains. The enemy scouts had warned Iraqi forces in the village prior to their capture. McReynolds' wingman, Sergeant Maurice Harris, remained at the limit of advance and scanned into the village through the blowing sand. Sergeant Harris's Bradley came under 23mm cannon and machine gun fire. He reported to his platoon leader, who responded, "Well, kill him." This engagement and the 23-minute battle that followed revealed 10 essential elements of the success in the battle that remains relevant today. H.R. McMaster.
The Abracast. Occult. History. Conspiracy. Violence.
All right, welcome to, this is going to be part two of the Battle of 73 Easting. If you're just jumping into this episode for whatever reason, I suggest you go back and listen to the episode right before this one first, because we kind of jump right into the beginning of the fight here. So we're missing an awful lot of context and stuff. Welcome to the show. Thank you for tuning in again for this episode. Before we get rolling, I just want to give a shout out. Please support the show in any way you can. You could rate and review it for free on iTunes or whatever. You could spread the disease, let someone that you know know about the show, or pick up some comic books. You know, the holiday season's right around the corner, and who doesn't want a little bullets, booze, blood, and blasphemy for the gift-giving season? You know, these comic books are important to me. It's kind of like my occupation, question mark. It's like a monument to my insanity, these things. And this podcast is probably, I would lump that in there too. You know what I got going on over there. There's politically incorrect, edgy, not your dad's, cape and tights kind of comics. Or, you know, alt-right, crazy, Islamophobic, anti-Christian trash comics. You know, whichever description fits you as an objective observer the best. A broken man named Johnny Axe walks away from life and forms a plan to travel to hell to get revenge. On the fallen Archangel Uriel and the Demon Lord Nizaro, who ruined Axe's life and led to the death of his one true love. Revenge in a Saloon Called Hell. This comic book is available right now at stigmatastudios.com. Okay. One of these days, I'm just going to produce this so I don't have to keep going. All right, so tonight we are going to continue the story of the Battle of 73 Easting. The last episode was a lot of context, and we took some time out to clown on Mika Brzezinski because her dad randomly came up while we were talking about the Carter Doctrine, when I was trying to explain what we were doing in Kuwait, Iraq, and in Saudi Arabia in the first place. So I mentioned the Carter Doctrine, and then I started talking about Mika Brzezinski. Next thing I know, I'm playing bits and pieces of MSNBC on the show. I don't know. So, let's see. So we left the boys, who were pushing through the desert, and they came across this little village that the Iraqis were using as an outpost. The then Captain H.R. McMaster and his tanks decimated this little village. So we're going to get into the rest of the battle here. Like, that was like the precursor to the Battle of 73 Easting. So we're going to get into the rest of it here. And as promised in the last episode, we're going to wind up dipping our little toes into the raging flat earth debate just a little bit. Just a little tiny bit. So a lot of the stuff from this episode comes from, there's an episode of Greatest Tank Battles, which is available on YouTube if you want to check it out. Just type in, probably if you just type in Battle of 73 Easting, it'll probably pop up pretty close to the top. And I suggest you, if you guys are interested in this battle, or you're interested in these episodes, you know, I'm telling these guys' stories, but they tell them way better than I do. They're a bunch of charming, funny guys. Especially the Bradley story that I'm going to be telling. A little bit later after we get through this 23 minutes, or 26 minutes. I can't remember my own 23 minutes. So, what I want you to do is I want you to mix up your Gen Jihad and make sure you have plenty of ammo and your seatbelt is buckled tightly, because tonight we are finishing the story of the last great tank battle of the 20th century. We are finishing the Battle of 73 Easting. Sorry, here we go. Lead from the front. Leaders must be forward to gain a clear picture and to make decisions. As Sergeant Harris engaged with 25 millimeter, Lieutenant Gunther moved forward to assess and further develop the situation. Gunther fired a tow missile into the center of the enemy position in the village to orient our tanks. After our gunner, Staff Sergeant Craig Koch, fired a subsequent tank round to mark center. All 9 tanks fired high explosive rounds into the village simultaneously to suppress the enemy position. Despite the secondary explosions in the village to its south, 1st Platoon maintained its primary observation to the east. So we see this is them. This is how they if you remember last episode, they rolled up on this village, on this position, with tanks forward. So they folded their lighter armored Bradley fighting vehicles, which they use in this scenario a lot as scouting elements. They moved them to the rear, and these tanks formed like a wedge position up front. And once they got there, what he's saying is they fired a round into the village to mark center. Now, the reason they did that is so the tanks on the tanks to the right of the center tank and the tanks to the left of the center tank knew which areas they had to cover. So the center tank's like, look, bam, that's the center of the village. You guys fire on the targets to the left. You guys fire on the targets to the right, and we're all going to fire at the same time. It was devastating to this little thing, this little outpost. These guys did not know what they were up against, and this is a fact. They had no idea. They, as we're going to find out, because remember the last episode where I was talking about how they were going to use the power of the desert, like the Fremen in Frank Herbert's Dune. They were like, look, we roll around out here, we get lost. So there's no way these fucking Americans are going to come out here with their tanks and try to get through this desert. Like there's no way. There's even H.R. McMaster in the last episode talked about how they were using sand tables to track their movement in the featureless desert. So what the enemy didn't know at this point in time is that we developed a global positioning system. We have satellites in orbit in outer space where they can use to triangulate these GPS devices, and these guys knew exactly where the fuck they were. The battle is called the Battle of 73 Easting. Easting is a line on a map. So, and this is one of the things I was talking about the flat Earth thing, because it's like you listen to the flat Earth guys and they're like, oh well, there's towers, and the towers, and they can bing the atmosphere from these towers. You don't understand how big this fucking desert is. These guys are rolling. There's no fucking towers out there. Their computers were communicating with a piece of machinery that was orbiting around the spherical planet Earth. There's gonna be more on this flat Earth thing later. I mean, you guys probably don't even. Hey, you want to know proof of a round Earth? You want to know proof of a planet Earth? You look at your round Earth map. Where Japan's kind of like on the, because they have to skew everything. So you look at like where Japan is on your flat Earth map. Go to Google, type out flat Earth map, and find a flat Earther map. China is like up top, or Japan and China are like up top. They're like close to being north of this like ice wall that supposedly surrounds our disk. And then you look at like where America, the United States of America is, and it's kind of like off to the left, and it's kind of like cockeyed sideways. So you can imagine where Hawaii is. So you think of Pearl Harbor, and you fucking tell me how Japan is going to sneak up on Hawaii from being way up there. But if you look at the globe, it makes pretty good sense. This is my rant for the day. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you I'm sorry, flat earthers. Number 2, shoot first. If you know where friendly forces are and there is not danger of civilian casualties, do not hesitate to shoot or conduct reconnaissance by fire. The side that shoots first has tremendous advantage. He's talking about initiative. Staff Sergeant David Lawrence was the commander of 1st Platoon's northernmost Bradley when his gunner, Sergeant Bradley Feltman, said, "Hey, I've got a hot spot out there. I'm not sure what it is." Lawrence responded, "Put a toe in it. See what it is." This is called reconnaissance by ammunition. Put a toe in it. We'll see what it is. A toe is a missile that the Bradleys have. We're going to talk a lot more about tow missiles and Bradleys in a little while. Put a toe in it. See what it is. Lawrence identified the hotspot as a T-72 as the turret was ripped from its hole in an ensuing explosion. And we're going to talk about this phenomenon of the turrets being blasted from the holes in just a minute. Our troops' experience was consistent with Erman Rommel's observation in his World War I book, Infantry Attacks. Quote, "I have found again and again in encounters, actions, that the day goes to the side that is first to plaster its opponent with fire," unquote. Okay, so McMaster is talking about initiative there. Sun Tzu would agree. You take great pains to control your battlefield and to choose the environment in which you fight, and also who can hit who first. This is the sucker punch, this kind of theory. All right, so they push forward. These tanks push forward, and this is Eagle Troop now. All this so far has been Eagle Troop. They're pushing forward, and they through this sandstorm. And what they wind up doing is they stumble into this into the enemy's defensive position. So they realize that the village that they just said to this village, "Fuck your couch." They fucked this village's couch, and then they moved on, and they realized that was just that it wasn't a patrol. It was an outpost to give warning of when the Americans were going to get there. So they peek this little crest, and they find a whole defensive position. This is a whole company of vehicles, and they're in what's called a reverse slope defense, which is a position on on the reverse slope of an elevated terrain feature like a ridge or the side of an opposite attacking position, so like a hill, and it's designed to limit the enemy's power to observe the position, and it also limits effectiveness. Well, in theory, this is what they thought. It limited the effectiveness of long range guns. It also makes you vulnerable as you are. Okay, so think of a tank. A tank. It moves on treads, right? So think of a hill. Okay, so you have like the part of the hill where the tanks are, and then you have the reverse slope where the enemy positions are. So as your tank is moving up over the ridge, you are exposing your belly to a bunch of people that should be waiting and ready for you. You have no defenses when you're showing the bottom of your hull at all. And if you guys go back and listen to like one of the real early episodes, tanks, I did a thing on like tanks of World War too. I think the last story that I did actually talks about a guy who did this. He backed his tank up, and when the guy was like coming up over something, he exposed his hull, the belly of his hull. And so that's another thing that this reverse slope defensive position will do if you're paying attention. Okay, so these guys had a pretty good. I mean, it's an antiquated doctrine, but it's a Soviet doctrine. These guys were doing the reverse slope defensive position isn't necessarily a Soviet doctrine. It's been used throughout history, like Napoleon used to use it. But they were dug in. They had a good plan. They were in a coiled defense, and the area was also surrounded by mines to disrupt movement. This is mine, countermine, mobility, counter mobility. This is my bread and butter as a combat engineer. Counter mobility, mines, all this kind of stuff. So what they didn't know, though, was they didn't know that their doctrine was antiquated. They didn't know that the paradigm was about to be changed due to the technology of the M1A1 main battle tank. So this thing, like I said, I'm not going to get into a tale of the tape with these vehicles, because I mean, like you could just go on Wikipedia and find how fast it goes, what's the armor like, what kind of stuff does it shoot. We're going to get into that a little bit at the very end with the M1A1 because it's so impressive and it figures into the last story I'm going to tell. So, like I said, go reference that stuff if you're really that interested. But I feel like it just slows down the narrative, it slows down the stories. But I'm going to say that these things fire basically two different kinds of rounds: a sable round, which is an armor-piercing dart. The high density, it's made out of depleted uranium, and a high explosive anti-tank round, which is basically like, okay, when you're a combat engineer, you have a shaped charge. It's one of the things that you're doing when you're actually doing counter mobility, and you're trying to make a road real difficult to pass over, or you're destroying it. It's not the movies. Like, you just don't throw a block of C4 on the road and the road explodes and you could see like the explosion from outer space. It's not like that at all. You have to have these shaped charges, which are like these scientific marvels. It's like the thing blows up so fast. It's like if you have a bomb, if you want to blow like something up, you have to tamp the explosives with something, because bombs will explode in a circle outwards. Like when Neo and Agent Smith was fighting in the rain at the end of that last Matrix movie, and they'd hit each other, and then like there would just be like a shock, like a circular shock wave. Like, that's what an explosive does. So in order to direct kind of the explosion or help direct it, you tamp it down. You get like sandbags or something like that, and that will kind of help push the explosion in the way that you want. So that's what the shape charge does. It's designed to be built for the blast just to go down. It just goes down, and there's also cratering charges that do this too on a way crazier scale, because it melts glass to become a funnel. It's fucking insane. This is my problem. The other day my wife talked to me and she was like, what's this thing about Templar Knights? And he's just like 3 hours later she's like starting to fall asleep, and I'm still like, and in 1307 Godfrey or Jacques de Molay. Yeah, it's terrifying. But anyhow, so I'm gonna calm down for a second, regain my bearings. All right. So these high explosive anti-tank rounds are basically flying shaped charges, which is both terrifying and awesome. The HE rounds, however, exploits the weakness of the Soviet doctrine, or what they call Soviets have a different theory of where to store ammo than we do. They store their ammunition around the inside of the turret. Okay, well, hold on. I'm going to back up. Oh, here, I'll just finish this. They store their ammunition around the inside of the turret. So if you can puncture that armor and get an explosive round into those ammo magazines that are stored around the turret, you can pop the Russians' tank turret right off the hull. Boom! All the explosion, all the heat and the destruction funnels it up, and it just pops the top of the tank off. It's crazy. 3. Fight through the fog of battle. Fight through the fog of battle. Be prepared for confusion and concurrent activity as we suppress enemy positions in the village. And while Lawrence was launching a missile, the troop received permission to advance to the 70 easting. I instructed 1st Platoon to resume movement east. Lieutenant Petschek did not respond immediately because Lawrence was reporting on the platoon radio net, contact, east tank. Simple orders and complete reports are essential to maintaining common understanding in the battle. 4. Follow your instincts and intuition. As Sergeant Feltman launched the TOW missile, I decided to go to tank's lead formation and instructed green and white. What he's talking about is, remember how he said that they marked the center of the village and the tanks on the right-hand side and the tanks on the left-hand side? So he's basically, they have predetermined fire teams for the situation. So he's got a fire team probably of 4 tanks or 2 tanks and a fire team of another 2 tanks. And they're the green and they're the white. The tank platoons, to follow my move, 1st Platoon pulled in behind as the tank wedge moved forward and covered the tank's rear. 3rd Platoon retained responsibility for flank security. As we began moving forward, 1st Platoon responded to the contact report on their platoon radio net, began firing 25mm high explosive munitions across the front. It was a little unnerving for the tanks as we moved forward, and I gave 1st Platoon a ceasefire order. Red 1, this is Black 6, cease fire. The 2 tank platoons were slightly delayed as our tank came over the crest of the imperceptible rise north of the village. Sergeant Craig Koch, the gunner, reported tanks direct front. I counted 8 T-72s in prepared positions, and they were at close range and visible to the naked eye. Okay, so this is them. They're seeing the reverse slope position now. This is what they're talking about. 5. Use standard unit fire and battle drills. Aim to overwhelm the enemy upon contact and retain the initiative through speed of action. As Sergeant Koch fired the main gun and destroyed the first tank, I sent a contact report to the troop. This is Black 6. Contact east. 8 armored vehicles, green and white. Are you with me? Sergeant Koch destroyed 2 more tanks as our tank platoon accelerated movement. All 9 tanks began engaging together as we advanced. In approximately 1 minute, everything in the range of our gun was in flames. Fire distribution and control allowed us to destroy a much larger enemy force in a very short period of time. And this was, he says everything in range of his guns, but this was all super close range. Like, they just rolled down. They closed the distance. They actually, they closed the distance. McMaster actually tells a story that he's firing on these tanks, and they're so close, he couldn't differentiate between the gun going off and the tank exploding. These tanks were rolling through as they were closing distance. They were driving through landmine fields. This is the armored version of walking on water. This is the tank version of Jesus Christ. Can I get an amen? Like, it used to be when a tank rolled into a minefield, they would, like, you got to call up the engineers, you got to clear a path through the minefield, however you're best going to do that. I can literally do a whole show, probably series of shows on different methods to clear minefields or whatever. But these tanks were just like, fuck it, we're moving fast enough, just go through them. And they're like, hey, I think we're hitting a mine. And I was like, don't stop. I think they talk about mines here. Okay, foster initiative. This is the initiative thing. Every trooper understood how our platoons and the troop conducted fire and maneuver. Our tank driver, Specialist Christopher Hendenskog, knew that he had to steer a path that permitted both tank platoons to get their guns into the fight. He turned 45 degrees to the right and kept our normal frontal armor towards the first enemy tanks we engaged. He drove through a minefield. He avoided anti-tank mines, reporting on the intercom, "Sir, I think you need to know we just went through a minefield." And I knew it would be dangerous to stop right in the middle of an enemy kill zone. Hendenskog saw that our tank platoons had a window of opportunity to shock the enemy and take advantage of the first blows that Sergeant Koch had delivered. Some 7. Use the tanks to take the brunt of the battle. Tanks drove around the anti-tank mines, and Bradleys and other vehicles followed in their tracks. Our squadron's S3 tank, commanded by Major Douglas McGregor, hit an anti-tank mine, and the blast damaged the tank only slightly. It continued the attack and made rapid repair when we halted. We ran over anti-personnel mines, but they sounded like microwave popcorn popping and had no effect on our armored vehicles. The rate of fire of our tanks allowed enemy tanks to fire only 2 errant main gun rounds on the outset of the battle, and 2 later as the troop assaulted. Enemy machine gun fire had no effect on the troops' advance. The psychological shock of our tanks advancing undaunted towards their defensive position paralyzed and panicked the enemy. Fuck yeah. So just to kind of talk about the paradigm change that I was saying, these T-72s, they still had hand-cranked turrets. So there's still there's a dude inside there cranking with his hands as fast as possible to turn the turret, And then there's another dude who's aiming. And he's like, okay, stop, a little bit to the left. Okay, a little bit more to the right. Just a scooch to the right, a scooch to the right. So, that's the level of technology they were at. Now, think about the level of technology as these Abrams tanks. These fools thought actual jets were attacking them. They're like, there's no way that these are tanks. And as McMaster points out, there's a psychological aspect to the capability of this machine. When you're just think of if you have a slingshot and someone attacks you with an M16. You're like, how, if in your experience, the slingshot or the bow and arrow is the most advanced fucking piece of armament that you have, and then someone's like, oh yeah, by the way, check out my M16, it's going to be like an alien's attacking you. That's what it's like. If aliens with TIE fighters were to come down and have to fight tanks that's kind of, or have to fight our airplanes or something, that's maybe not a good example. I don't know. Okay, so 8, be prepared for misfires and degraded operations. Lieutenant Jeff DiStefano's tank crew came around the village, destroyed an enemy tank, acquired a second tank at very close range that was traversing on them. That's what he means. The little guy was grinding to move the turret to them. It was the barrel was traversing, or the whole tank might have been moving for him. A round got stuck in the breech of DiStefano's cannon. The loader grabbed hold of the loader's hatch, kicked the round in, and the breech came up. And the gunner, Sergeant Matthew Clark, destroyed the T-72. In another example, Staff Sergeant Digby ordered Private First Class Charles Bertubin to reload tow missiles. Bertubin could not get the cargo hatch open. However, when the lightweight wrestler kicked the hatch release, he sheared it off. Rather than tell his Bradley commander that he could not get the tows reloaded, he jumped out of the back door while the vehicle was under small arms machine gun fire, climbed onto the back of the Bradley, loaded both missiles, then tapped his Bradley commander on the shoulder while yelling, "Tows are up!" Staff Sergeant Digby nearly jumped out of his skin because he thought that an Iraqi had climbed onto the Bradley. Coordinate between platoons and ensure mutual support. The burning tanks and personnel carriers of the enemy's first defensive line formed a curtain of smoke that concealed the enemy further to the east. As our tanks assaulted through the smoke, we saw other enemy armored vehicles in large numbers of infantry running to get back to the subsequent trench lines and positions. We destroyed the enemy armored vehicles quickly, shot the infantry with the machine guns. As we closed the distance with them, pockets of enemy soldiers threw their arms up. The soldiers were disciplined. Turrets turned away from any enemy soldier with his hands raised. Tank platoon leaders asked scout platoons to pick up observation of enemy infantry as their Bradleys came through the smoke. The scouts saw that the enemy had used false surrender to gain better position. Enemy soldiers were re-shouldering their rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. Our Bradleys surprised the enemy and killed them before they could engage tanks effectively. We'll just do the last one here. 10. Take risks to win. Hold on. Take risks to win. Because Eagle Troop pressed the assault, the enemy could not respond effectively. As we cleared the westernmost defensive positions, our executive officer, Lieutenant John Gifford, broke in on the radio and says, "I know you don't want to know this right now, but you're at the limit of advance. You're at 70 Easting." I responded, "Tell them we can't stop. Tell them we're in contact and we have to continue this attack. Tell them I'm sorry." We had surprised and shocked the enemies. Stopping now would have allowed them to recover. As Erwin Rommel observed in infantry attacks, quote, "The man who lies low and awaits developments usually comes off second best. It's fundamentally wrong to halt or to wait for more forces to come up and take part in the action," unquote. Eagle Troop had continued the attack towards another very subtle ridgeline, and on which the enemy positioned his reserve, a coil of 18 T-72 tanks. Major Mohammed later told one of our troops that he had not known that he was under attack until a soldier ran into his elaborate command bunker yelling, "Tanks, tanks!" By the time he got to his observation post, all the vehicles in the defensive position to the west were in flames. He ordered the reserve behind him to establish a second defensive line, but it was too late. Eagle Troop's tanks crested the rise and entered their assembly area. The tanks were starting to move out when we destroyed them at close range. Again, McMaster talks about this thing where he's like, you couldn't tell the difference between the enemy tank exploding and our gun going off. Shrapnel's flying over the heads of friendly tanks. Blue sparks are shooting up. Remember, they're shooting these things sometimes with depleted uranium. What does that do to a piece of metal? That is fucking crazy. Continuing the attack to beyond the limit advance was consistent with the command climate that not only encouraged but also demanded that junior leaders take initiative. This is what in the military it's called decentralized command. This is where you've trained your junior officers, your NCOs. You can anticipate their movements and their decision-making abilities, and you let them work. Decentralized command, or this thing that H.R. McMaster is talking about, demanded that your junior leaders take initiative. This is, when you hear people in the corporate world bitch about like micromanagement or something, this is the opposite of micromanagement. This is like, it's almost no management for the time being. It's like, you know what you got to do, go fucking get it done. Colonel Holder told us during training in Germany that because of the pace of the action and the size of the cavalry battlefield, important decisions have to be made quickly by junior leaders in contact. All regimental leaders must train their juniors to do the right things and then trust them to act independently. Leaders must teach and practice mission orders. It was a message all leaders in the regiment internalized. The furious action, and we're going to talk later about this instance where a company commander basically gives a lieutenant of his platoon, he's got 4 tanks, and he's like, yeah, go and do this crazy thing. And he just trusted that it was going to get done, and I don't want to spoil the end of it, but the furious action lasted 23 minutes. The troops stopped when there was nothing left to shoot. Sporadic contact ranged from nuisance machine gun fire to one company-sized counterattack of T-72s and BMP armored personnel carriers. Tanks and Bradleys destroyed enemy vehicles at long range from the dominating positions on the ridge. 3 Bradleys from 1st Platoon, led by Lieutenant Michael Petchak, encountered and destroyed 4 T-72s as they moved north to reestablish physical contact with G Group, Ghost Troop. This is the situation that we're going to be talking about here when I get done with this. Medics treated and evacuate enemy wounded. Crews cross-leveled ammunition. Mortars suppressed enemy infantry further to the east as our fire support officer, Lieutenant Dan Davis, called in devastating artillery strikes on enemy logistical bases. Scouts and a team under the control of First Sergeant Bill Verrill cleared bunkers using grenades and satchel charges. Satchel charges, again, are a staple of any combat engineer, and then led a much-needed resupply convoy through minefields to our rear. A psychological operations team broadcasted surrender appeals forward of the troop, and the troop took the first 100 prisoners, including a brigade commander. Soldiers segregated, searched, and secured prisoners through the night. Many prisoners cried because they had not expected such humane treatment. Their officers had told them that we would execute them. Their prisoners were incredulous when our soldiers returned their wallets without taking any of the money that they had looted from Kuwait City. Just after 2,200 hours, First ID conducted a forward passage of lines in the 3rd Squadron's area of operation to our south. So they cut through this defense, they cut through the minefield, they cut through all these prepared enemy positions like hot butter. What he's talking about is there were reserves with the thing in the command post, and they were all engaged. They drove through and blasted all of this. They engaged tanks point blank. Some of the engines on these tanks weren't even started. They killed hundreds of soldiers. Maybe they'll talk about it here. 50 T-72s, 25 armor personnel carriers, 40 trucks, and numerous other vehicles. So this is in the conclusion. The morning after the battle, the soldiers were exhausted. Many of the approximately 50 T-72s, 25 armor personnel carriers, 40 trucks, and numerous other vehicles that the troop destroyed were still smoldering. Our troop had taken no casualties. We thanked God and determined to keep our edge. As we implemented a rest plan and escorted parties of enemy prisoners to bury their fellow soldiers killed during the assault, the troops' leadership huddled to conduct an after-actions review. As news of a ceasefire reached us, we discussed the previous day's fight to identify what we might do to improve our readiness for the next battle should we be called upon to continue the offensive. Whew. All right, so we got two more stories here. They're going to be a little bit quicker because I just want to illustrate some of the same lessons McMaster talked about in his essay. They're not all; they don't all have to do with Ghost Troop or Eagle Troop. So going forward, the unit that we're going to be talking about is Ghost Troop. That was Eagle. This is Ghost. They're also both featured on the Greatest Tank Battles TV show that I mentioned a few times already. And these guys, like I said, they tell their stories way better than I could. So if you're interested in this, go check it out. It's all full of personality and stuff, and you know they're just awesome. They're awesome stories. And yeah, so I'm just doing this just to talk about some specific points. The first one, hold on. Yeah, the first one we're going to talk about are... Hold on. Okay, so this is a Bradley Scout. So, Ghost Troop has lost contact with Eagle Troop. As McMaster says in this... I think it was the conclusion. Oh, no. As he says here... They encountered and destroyed T-72s as they moved north to reestablish physical contact with G Group. So the Ghost Troop guys are over here. The Eagle Troop guys are over here. During the battle, they lost visual contact of each other. So McMaster sent four of his, I guess, Bradleys. Let me find this other page. I just read this. Okay, he sent 3 of his Bradleys to go find Ghost Troop. And Ghost Troop sends 2 of their Bradleys to go find Eagle Troop. So this story opens up with these two Ghost Troop Bradleys moving through the desert trying to find Eagle Troop. And they're moving up, and they could start to see, like, stuff. They could start to see objects there in the horizon, or, like, whatever, coming up in the desert. And the lieutenant who's in charge of this little deployment is like, hey, pull up on this little mound over here and hold still. So the driver pulls up on the little mound, and as the lieutenant's looking, he sees that all these little things that he sees out there are tanks. And so I think the count is 8 at this point, or 7 at this point. So he's looking out there and he sees some tanks, and he's like, "Oh, there's a bunch of tanks out there. Could this be Eagle Troop that I'm looking for?" And so he looks in, like, his optic scope or whatever, and he's like, "Oh no, these are enemy tanks. Okay, shit. Where is Eagle Troop?" And at this time, his driver is like, "Sir, there's a tank to our immediate front." And the lieutenant's looking through the scope, and he's like, "Yeah, I see it, no problem." And he's like, "No, there's a tank to our front." And he's like, "Yeah, I got it. I'm looking at it." And he goes, "A tank to our immediate front." So the guy opens his hatch, the lieutenant opens his hatch, and he leans out, and the little mound that they pulled the Bradley on was actually the dirt from this a dug-in position of this T-72 tank. They're just staring at this T-72 tank. So these tanks, they're designed to not every day point the gun, these 25 millimeter cannons, to the ground. You have to use a commander override to do it. So he grabs this commander override and he max deflects this 25 millimeter cannon, like it's just pointed right at this tank, and he just pop, 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 bing, 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 and at that range it's going through. This tank just starts fucking smoking, not moving. It's just he's fucking killed this tank with this Bradley, which is unheard of. But because he's basically parked right on top of it, the bullets can get through. And then they notice that the other 7 tanks start moving their turrets. They're all like, now there's some activity, some diesel plumes. They all know that he's there at this point. So he's like, well, maybe we should back up. And he's like, well, so he starts to back up, but he's like, where am I going to go? Like, what am I going to do? Like, where is this fucking Eagle Troop at? So these tanks start aiming at him. And what he does is he deploys... he has his gunner deploy the tow missiles. So tow missiles, if you look at a Bradley tank, there's like a little shoebox attached to like the one side of the turret. So it pops up and there's 2 missiles in there. And I don't know what it stands for. I used to know. I don't know anymore. But they're called TOW, tow missiles. So the little box pops up like this and he's like, shoot that tank. And there's a funny story about how the gunner was like, I don't want to shoot the tank. I can't identify that it's an enemy tank, because he's looking at it through his infrared. So he's like, okay, well, go turn your infrared off. And then he sees and he's like, oh yeah, that's T-72. And he's like, shoot it. So they blast this thing with this tow missile. So this tow missile comes out. It's fin stabilized. It actually has a wire, at least one wire, that runs from the missile to the tank. And the guy can steer the missile. It's like a video game. He could steer the missile to where he wants it to go. It's got little thrusters on each side to make course corrections. It's wild. Anyhow, bam, they fucking destroy this tank. And then they're like, the next tank is pointing at them, so they're like, let's shoot this next tank. They shoot it. The tow missile misfires, just falls to the ground shortly past the gun tube. Boom, it hits. And they're like, what are we going to do now? So remember, they sent 2 tanks out. So this guy's wingman pulls up. And the way the lieutenant says, he pulls up and he services that tank with a missile, kills that tank, kills another tank. So already they've killed 1, 2, 3, 4 tanks between these 2 Bradleys. But the problem now is that they don't have any tow missiles left, because their shoebox only has 2 holes in it. You know, the tow missile launcher only has got 2 tow missiles in it. So they got to do a reload drill. So his wingman backs up and starts changing out the tow missiles. Well, this tank's pointed his gun at them, and they're just like keep shooting at it, and he's like just keeps plinking it with these 25 millimeter, pink, 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 pink. And at this distance, they're not going through. It's not like shooting it at point blank, And so the tank the wingman Bradley pulls up, blows and shoots another 2 tanks. So between these guys, they're taking care of this whole like little platoon or whatever of these T-62s. And then he says that later the Eagle Troop tanks that they were linking up with finally show up, and the guy's like, or maybe it's the Bradleys show up. The Bradleys show up. And they're talking to our Bradleys, the story that we just told, and they're like, hey, there's tanks over there. And he's like, yeah, I know. Okay, anyhow, so I just want to tell that story because it's all about, like, dude's not leaving his wingman. They're taking initiative. If they would have withdrew or whatever, and also taking the initiative and just blasting this tank that was in the defilade is pretty crazy. Like, it's amazing. I imagine that guy's never going to have to buy another beer his whole entire right. We're getting a little long in the tooth here, but we're gonna drive on. We're gonna get through this goddamn thing today. Okay, so the next and last story is a unit of the Ghost Troop guys. So they're rolling through, and they're rolling through because they're having a sandstorm. So they're moving through, and like I said, they're moving slow. This is where the guy's talking about like moving like at the pace of a man can walk, and how you can feel like the treads, each individual treads as the road wheels are turning. And they're looking through their infrared or their heat vision. I guess that's infrared. So it's like when you look at like movies and they're like, you know how it's like the night vision and it's the green and everybody calls it infrared. That's not infrared. That's night vision. That actually amplifies to a insane degree ambient light. It amplifies ambient light and lets you see. That's why when you have a new guy in the platoon and you're like, hey man, try on these night vision goggles, they're pretty cool, right? And they're like, yeah man, wow, I can see everything. And you shine a flashlight in the thing, that's why it blinds them. If that was infrared, you shining a flashlight, I don't think it would blind you because it registers heat. Like you might get a small change or whatever because of the heat of the light bulb. But these tanks, these Abrams, have actual night vision, or they have actual infrared. They're rolling up, and what they think is that they see these white hot signatures coming out of the ground and like running towards like a bump. And Lieutenant Andy Kilgore at the time goes, if they're running out of that bump and they're running to that bump, that's probably a vehicle. So he tells his gunner, shoot that vehicle. So automatically they just start, bam! They fucking destroy that thing. Like I said, engine's not even started. They were still running up there. But the thing with these tanks in this infrared, this is why you always need to roll with a combat engineer, right? Because when you're like, say you're facing a force or whatever of a tank, if you know where they're like sleeping at night or whatever, like you could totally fuck a tank up because it's like they don't stand guard like normal people do. They just sit in there and look at their like fucking computer screens or whatever. And if you plug two 9-volt batteries in with each other, they start getting super hot. And you could trick the people inside to point the gun, to point all their optics systems away from where you're approaching. You could throw the batteries out there, like, and they start getting hot, and you can see the tank. You can see them start to scan around, like, hey man, what's that? Is that what is that? Is that just like a mouse or something or whatever? And then like you could throw another one, and you could see them leaving their whole backside open just to like climb up on, throw satchel charges under, whatever. I don't think that's classified information. That's how I used to bust tanks when I was in. That's how I used to bust Abrams when I was in. Okay, so, but on the battlefield, it is slightly different. You know, if you can't sneak up on it in the middle of the night with 9-volt batteries, you know. And you wouldn't just throw the satchel charge in there, because the possibility of getting through their armor is questionable. So what you do is you would jam the satchel charges in their road wheels, because if you can't destroy the tank, at least you can immobilize it. Counter mobility, people. It's all about counter mobility at some point. So these guys are moving through, and they start blasting these tanks. Bam, 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 bam. The problem is with the wind, how it is, the destroyed tanks start making a curtain of smoke going across. So they were successful at blasting these tanks. They were successful at blasting these tanks and trucks and BMPs or whatever they are. The problem is now is that they're cut off visually from whatever's on the other side, and they're like, we could see movement on the other side, but we don't know what it is. So Lieutenant Andy Kilgore asked his troop commander, who's this captain who's hilarious. I don't remember his name. I don't have it written down. It's in that Greatest Tank Battles episode of 73 East thing. And he's like, hey, man, I want permission to take my 4 tracks and poke my nose through the smoke and see what's on the other side. And the captain's like, all right, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead and go do that. So Lieutenant Andy Kilgore takes his 4 tanks and they poke their tanks through the smoke. And when they get to the other side, all hell breaks loose. They basically stumble into a whole company position. 4 tanks versus a whole company position. They didn't call in a spot report, so all the captain he sends these 4 tracks in, and then all he sees is he calls it Armageddon. Armageddon breaks out behind the screen of these tanks, and Andy Kilgore says it takes a matter of minutes, but they destroy everything. So I want to take a second here to talk about these long-range shots that these M1A1s were taking. So they're putting a round about the size of a grapefruit into something a little bit bigger than like a van, as they describe it, from 2 miles away. These Iraqis were doomed. I mean, from the start, they couldn't even get within range of their own enemy. They couldn't get within range of their own gun to be effective in any kind of way at all. And so I was just like, wow, that's crazy. They were shooting from 2 miles away. Like, that's banana. So they destroyed all these guys. They actually took a casualty. I didn't write a whole bunch of stuff down about the casualty because it's quite depressing. But they took a couple casualties. One of their tanks or one of their Abrams got hurt or whatever. But I'm hung up on this shooting something from over 2 miles away. And so I was like, well, I mean, how do you do that? Like, I start thinking about flat Earth. And I start thinking about, well, wouldn't the curvature of the planet affect a shot from 2 miles away or over 2 miles away? Wouldn't the round doesn't have time to slow down within 2 miles. I mean, we're talking about something that this weapon fires fast. So anyhow, I'm like, okay, and then so as I'm doing research on the guns, on the firing systems of this Abrams, I find out that their gun tubes are smooth bored. And that goes against everything that I know about rifles. You know, you want to put the spin on it because that will increase the velocity. It'll increase aiming because it's spinning. It's not moving like a slug through space or the air. So I started trying to do research about why they moved to smooth bores, and I found all this crazy information on a forum on calguns.net. So I'm just going to read 2 entries, all right? And they've been out there for a while. They've been out there since like May of 2010. So I'm just going to read, this guy's name is MST Laurent, wrote, the reason they went to smooth bore is because of the velocity of the projectiles, not for accuracy. When the projectiles start going above a certain velocity, the exact number escapes me, they will strip the rifling out of a barrel. The APF-SDS round on the Abrams comes out at 5,700 FPS, for example. So they changed the smoothbore cannon to create a fin-stabilized projectiles that didn't need rifling to be accurate. Going with fin-stabilized rounds also allows you to go with a longer, thinner penetrator, which will yield better penetration. And you're looking at me and you're like, what the fuck does this have to do with the flat Earth? I'm getting there, my friends. The reason it is so accurate is because of the computer. The ballistic computer takes everything into account. Range finding, air pressure, wind speed, and direction. Those are just the beginning. It has a device. This blew me away. It has a device on the barrel that measures barrel deflection due to uneven heating, stress, etc. It takes into account so that means if a heavy enough thing was sitting on the barrel, this computer would take that into account. It would be able to figure it out, take it into account, and fix it, put it in the firing solution. It takes into account the rotation of the Earth at their current latitude. All this data lets it put the round right where the crosshairs say it will go. And that is the really impressive part. A guy named Suvrov expands on this. Pretty much covers it. The only thing is that the heat round loses effectiveness when they are spinning, and the fin-stabilized projectiles do not need to spin stabilized. Do not need to be spin stabilized, so rifling is counterproductive to both types of munitions. Smooth bore also allows for a better seal and thus more velocity. What he's saying is there's not holes in the rifling of the barrel for gas to escape, so all the possible gas and energy and power is moving the round through the barrel. The lack of rifling will also mean a longer tube life. The Russians and Brits have been using smoothbore guns since the 60s. Us and the Germans were relatively latecomers to the party. When the gunner or commander engages a target, he will place the reticle on the target and then laze the target. This laser will give the ballistics computer a range to target. This computer will then take the range data plus such variables as crosswind, barometric pressure, outside air temperature, ammunition temperature, vehicle cant, and the gun turret slew speed, which is a measure of how fast the target vehicle is moving in relationship to the tank that you're in, and come up with a ballistic solution. The cannon will then move, inducing lead and hold over based on the ballistic solution. The gunner then has only to make sure the reticle is still on the target and fire. The ballistic computer also will correct for such things as barrel wear and measured ammunition lot variances. Do you understand how crazy that is? If a round is made at a different time than the next round, I guess you might scan it in, so the computer knows that there's a lot variance in the make of the round, and it measures for that, or it accounts for that. As mentioned, a muzzle reference sensor, the MRS, will measure for any warp in the gun tube due to unequal heating of the tube, and this information is fed to the ballistic computer periodically. The fire control system is only half of the matter. The other part, now this is crazy. I did not mention this, even though it is in my notes. I skipped over it. The other part is the suspension and stabilization system. The suspension on the Abrams allows for an incredibly smooth ride over rough terrain. It rides like a Cadillac. The turret and gun is stabilized on all three axes by multiple gyroscopes. That, along with the hydraulic system, will allow the gun tube to stay locked on a target on the whole of a tank, undulates underneath it. The Abrams is an awesome vehicle. So what this dude is saying, and the way these tanks are built, is they have a locking targeting system. So say like, remember, what is it? Endo bike? Remember where you build the track and you put all the speed bumps in and your bike's got to like boom, 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 over all these speed bumps? It's a video game on Nintendo. Come on, 8-bit. Let's go. 8-bit. So you build one of these tracks and you have a tank and you drive the tank over it, and the computer, the technology involved in this tank will let you lock onto a target, go over all the bumps, but the turret part of the tank stays locked on the target, even as the mobility part of the tank is like rocking and rolling to get over these speed bumps. That's what they're talking about. Now, liken that to what I mentioned earlier about these T-72s, where the guys are like manually cranking. The guys in there are like manually cranking the loaders to turn the tank, and like the guy that's aiming is like, okay, a scooch to the left, a scooch to the left, a tad to the right, a tad to the right. Like that's what I'm talking about. This paradigm change. They call it the last great tank battle in the 20th century, but in some ways, you're like, if you look at the numbers, yeah, for sure. But if you don't look at the numbers, you're like, if you just look at the technology, I mean, it's like, it's like sending some Terminators to kill a fucking, like a bunch of cavemen. All right, thank you guys for tuning in and let me babble at you, even though I babble passionately. Please, if you can, support the show, rate and review on iTunes, buy some comics. That's the best way to do it because it helps me pay for stuff. And tell a friend about the show. Spread the disease. And I want to thank you guys for letting me talk to you about this. And I highly recommend, more than I've ever recommended anything for you guys, if you're interested in this, topic or whatever, to check out that greatest tank battles in history thing. And also, I want to encourage you guys to reach out to me. If you go on stigmatastudios.com, up in the upper left-hand corner, there's all my links to my social media and stuff. And I love just to hear what you guys think about this episode, or my thoughts about it, or, if you enjoyed it, or if you have any gripes, whatever. Reach out. Talk to me. Come on and love me. All right, in honor of these guys, these warriors that we talked about this evening, and, well, depends on when you're listening to the show. To me, it was last evening and this evening. I mentioned that they crossed a berm from Kuwait into Iraq, or from Saudi Arabia into Kuwait. That's what they did. They crossed there was a berm in the sand where they crossed it from Saudi Arabia into Kuwait. And as they went, I also mentioned this evening that they had a PSYOPs platoon with them. They had these gigantic speakers on the Humvee, and they would belt out like on these frequencies and these gigantic speakers about requests for them to give up. But when they were crossing the berms, the captain of Ghost Troop had them play Flight of the Valkyries. And he was like, yeah, it was pretty cool, but there was nothing meeting us on that side. So in honor of that guy, that captain that I keep talking about, I didn't write his name down. In honor of him, I'm going to play Flight of the Valkyries by Wagner. This is Richard Wagner. I don't own the rights to this. I'm just playing it because it's an awesome fucking piece of music, and it reminds me of Apocalypse Now. And I just love the idea of just this image in my brain about these tanks just flying over this berm in this featureless desert, running off to fight and defeat the enemy. Urgh. Here we go, everybody. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Bye. Bye. Ba-da-bum. Alright, that's enough. Alright, good night, everybody. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you next week. Bye!